a place and a space, a lived environment, like a city like Grand Rapids that's growing, and create it in a way, or help to develop it in a way in which it can be seen as a place that's welcoming for all. And so I think that the work that's before us is significant, but I think that, again, myself and my colleagues feel very good about the direction in which we're going.
Appreciate that. Just a few things to highlight over the last month or so since we last had this show. And with summer, there are a lot of these opportunities. We just came out of, as you mentioned, the Neighborhood Summit. Lots of opportunities to really have community members engaged. That's a good point. That is a focus of that, but also things that are happening now that it's summer. We just had Festival of the Arts, as you mentioned, but we also have splash pads and pools opening up, some new kayaking and canoeing opportunities, just trying to make some equitable opportunities for folks that live in the city and can really enjoy this city. Just wanted to see the importance of those kinds of things that are actually families, children, folks that can just get out and enjoy things, and how that really kind of fits into the scope of what maybe comes out of conversations with neighborhood summits, neighborhood matching funds. Just that seems to be a little bit of the underlying theme and purpose here.
Yeah. Well, I'll start it.
Please.
It's a tie.
Yeah.
Rock, paper, scissors. Well, I think activation has really been important since the pandemic, particularly the more that we can do outside, because for several reasons. Number one, opportunity to do it in a very safe environment. Two, we know that holistically it's healthy for our youth, and particularly those who experience so much time during the pandemic, limited by the opportunities that they have for extracurricular activities, whether it was organized sports or even for that limited time, we were not able to fully open all of our amenities as a city. And so the full activation of the parks has been very important. What we've learned since COVID is that it has been one of our most utilized assets as a city. And the more that we can keep our parks open, activated, and maintained, and we appreciate the work of the folks who have advocated for the Parks Millage, the more opportunity we provide for youth to be positively engaged in after school and summer activities. And that itself not only helps with youth development, but also focuses on an element of preventing unwanted type of youth activity, and particularly crime. So that coupled with not only youth engaging in our park and recreational amenities, but also we're continuing our employment effort to employ youth during the summer, and they can work in a park through the Grow 1000 program, among many other employers, and get paid up to 20 hours a week as a summer intern for almost 6 weeks.
That was actually one of my other points, was the West Michigan Works partnership for the Grow jobs. And how many youth can you put into the workforce for these internships? What's the goal there as far as employment this summer?
Well, the program is named Grow 1000 because we wanted 1,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're about 400 away. We've launched it in 2020. This will be our third summer doing it. And so pretty soon we're going to have to rename it to Grow 2000, because we're going to have hired over 1,000 kids. But yeah, we're looking at employing them in various jobs. We work with financial institutions, medical providers, governments, one of the employers, some of the community-based organizations, nonprofits. And so they can work on site. There'll be opportunities to work virtually and hybrid. They're going to get the chance to experience our real work environment as working professionals. And as we know with the pandemic, there's such a challenge of everybody being able to all work in on-site because of the need to be flexible as an employer.
Yeah, you know, the idea of, or if given the opportunity to think about just how devastating COVID-19 was in terms of the inability to gather, the inability, or the need to stay inside. And if it's one thing I can say about our beloved community, is just the abundance of green space, right? I mean, we have a city full of parks and areas in which we can gather, we can actually engage and be part of community. And so, the opportunities before us this summer are significant. And I think that we should expect to see an uptick of activities, both those that are planned as well as those that are impromptu. Because I think that we're trying to make up for lost time. And I think that that's a good thing in terms of really wanting to activate as much as we can, within the parks, but also recognizing that, it also is it's an effort to be even all the more focused on our young people. As the city manager has mentioned, the Grow 1000 effort it's important. It's very important because it really is part of, I think, a bigger plan of really wanting to try to grow our own. It's like, what is it going to take to keep our young people here? And for them to see Grand Rapids as a place in which they can prosper. I think that's a big part of it, as well as, again, all the other amenities that we have to provide, including, as I mentioned, green space and the ability just to go and I can remember, I'm not old at all, but I can remember back in the day when, it was just the freedom to go out and play. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing that compares to it, right? And because of technology these days, it's something that perhaps a lot of young people don't take advantage of. But wouldn't it be great to get back to that place where you just have a mindset, I just want to go outside and play. And I think that's the beauty of what we have in the cities. You could do that in Grand Rapids.
And play looks a lot differently than it did, obviously, years ago. And what we've tried to do is connect the natural environment in our parks with the digital environment. And so in this year's budget, we continue to expand Wi-Fi accessibility within our parks, both for people who want to interact with technology as well as some of the amenities, but also for people who don't have access because of the digital divide. And so we continue to find ways to help people gather and do it in a very vibrant way within our parks, whether it's programming the parks for events and activities, or just utilizing the park just to enjoy, or utilizing it as an extension of your yard or office now with the Wi-Fi activation.
Can you tell a little bit more about how the digital divide is being bridged with some of these park connectivities, some of the Wi-Fi that's available? Are there certain parks? We've talked, I think, with the mayor about maybe 3 parks that might have some of this coverage at this point, but where that's going? Yeah,
well, we started years ago. COVID felt like everybody aged. We started at the early onset, the first year of COVID, with a pilot of 10 parks. And I cannot recall all 10 off the top of my head, and we continue to try to expand it. And there's about another $100,000 in this year's budget for broadband accessibility. But we know, as you've said earlier, with the digital divide, and the parks that we identified are in our neighborhoods of focus. We know from a countywide perspective, obviously, the more rural the areas, the greater the need for connectivity or infrastructure. And in Grand Rapids, we have the infrastructure, so to speak. We have, for Wi-Fi access, there are street lights, there are traffic signals where devices could be attached. Whenever we redevelop streets or neighborhood, we can put the connectivity, the pipe, the conduit underground. But right now, it's just a matter of, can people afford it? You have it available, but is it affordable for everyone? And so there are federal resources that we're trying to push out for accessibility for residents, but we're also talking to some of the providers about doing more to help us bridge the digital divide.
Okay, appreciate that. We're going to take our first break and maybe talk a little bit more about how important it is to activate opportunities during the summers in particular. We'll be right back with after this break with City Connection.
For over 30 years after humble beginnings as a public access TV station, the Community Media Center has grown to be an active, multi-platform media and technology assistance organization, encouraging and enabling our community to push the creative boundaries. We power a variety of resources, including a music-centered community radio station, WYCE, a community venue with stage and screen at Wealthy Theater, citizen-driven journalism with the Rapidian, a web development team empowering local nonprofits, an education department that trains and broadens students' minds, and a free speech public access television studio, GRTV, where it all began. By introducing audiences to new voices and ideas, we enhance community engagement and create connections between artists and audiences, enriching our city's cultural offerings. We empower and collaborate with platforms and resources accessible to all and used by all. Every free democratic society depends on media, accessible to the community and uncensored by government. The Community Media Center continues this work for the media landscape of today and tomorrow. These platforms and services empower our neighbors to tell their stories and explore the richness of culture that Grand Rapids has to offer. Connect, discover, learn, create, and share. The Grand Rapids Community Media Center.
Welcome back to City Connection. In studio here at GRTV with me is a City Manager Mark Washington, along with the President of the Commission, Joe Jones, Second Ward Commissioner, and we were just talking a little bit about some of the importance of activities in the community, especially during the summer, but also let's move on into what's very important for the city right now is funding the next fiscal year, the fiscal year starting July 1, and an adopted budget. It was just passed by the Commission. Some significant things in that budget that really kind of speak to what we've been discussing a little bit. And City Manager, I thought you might want to address a little bit of that.
Well, first of all, the annual fiscal plan is one of the most significant acts that I can take a city manager and a city commission can do by vote in adopting our roadmap that aligns with policy. And so this year's budget is almost $600 million, and it's focused around our strategic priorities of having good government, being fiscally sustainable, economic opportunity and prosperity, health and environment, safety, making sure that we're a safe community, and making sure that there's mobility, and having a sustainable environment as well. And this year's budget for the third year was developed around crisis. We've still experienced the impact of COVID. We still have some of the racial and social tension in our community. We still have a climate crisis, and we still have economic uncertainty. And so the federal relief that we received from the ARPA plan, ARPA funds, was about $92 million. And we have until 2026 to utilize all those funds. And so about $32 million of that was utilized to subsidize our budget this year. Because of the pandemic, we had income tax loss, we had revenue was down from our parking program. And that was able to offset some of the costs that we expended during general fund and continue some of the services that you highlighted earlier in the previous segment. The Grow 1000 program is an example. Now that's primarily funded through donors and philanthropy, but we also have used some of the federal funding to help with that effort as well. And so In addition to our normal strategic priorities, City Commission looked at some of the challenges we were facing and said that they wanted to focus around several areas. One include housing and the unhoused, homelessness, the participatory budgeting process, another one. We continue to see incidents of violence and concerns around the safety of the community, but also how law enforcement officers interact in doing their jobs. So crime prevention as well as public safety reform is an area of focus in the budget, as well as continued development for economic opportunities, and such as some of the projects we have around 201 Market. Commissioner, were there other things you liked in the budget?
I think there was just the opportunity to take in the moment and realize that we have the great responsibility of being stewards of these resources and wanting to make the best decisions, but also trying to some degree to operate with a greater sense of targeted universalism, and recognizing that there are certain parts of our city that are in need of more resources. And so there was the increase into the Third Ward Equity Fund that was bumped up to $1 million. There was the recognition that there, over in the Northeast Corridor, over in the Crescent neighborhood, there's a need for an infusion there for potential investment and growth on the Plainfield Corridor. And so it's recognizing that the needs are significant, and yet we have a responsibility to make the best decisions that we have based on what's provided to us, both on reading through the budget, but also taking into consideration the recommendations coming from staff. And so I think that all in all, we were pleased to be able to approve the budget, which was it was approved fully. All of us were in favor of it. And yet, there's the recognition that we are, having to prepare for the next budget, right? So it's like, we get done with that, but we also realize that, there's not too far, we're not too far from preparing for what's to come in the next fiscal year for the budget. But again, I've been pleased, especially under the leadership of City Manager Washington, the process that we undertake is a much more fluid process with regards to not just understanding the budget, but also just getting the necessary knowledge that we need to be able to make good, prudent decisions. And so it's been very good.
We start the process, as you said, it seems like we're always in budget.
Yeah.
Because many people focus on the month of, we met for 5 weeks, April 26th all the way through May 24th for budget adoption. But we started preparing in October, November last year with the City Commission retreat for them to give some direction, listening to the public around prioritization and areas of focus. And that began to shape, where the recommendations for changes should be. And obviously, one of the things that happened right before the budget proposal was the April 4th shooting of Patrick Lyoya, the killing of Patrick Lyoya by a member of the police department. And so we needed to make sure that there were things that were in the budget that will help us improve public safety, both violence prevention. We continue to fund Cure Violence, which I got to credit Commissioner Jones and others, other commission, but Commissioner Jones was a very early adopter and supporter, along with Commissioner Kelly, I recall when I first arrived, asking for this evidence-based crime prevention program where citizens are part of disrupting the pattern of violence. And we approved funding in the budget a year or so ago, but fully funded it along with our partners, community partners, additional with that federal funding that we received this year in this budget to enhance that program, but also to increase the staffing of our oversight office. And I recall earlier conversations about that as well, that was a long community aspiration and priority. But doing it in a way that doesn't make the community less safe, because we have seen an increase in violence and crime, and 2020 was our most deadliest years in recent times, with over 38 homicides. And so we had to think holistically, but also this call from the community about over-policing. And there are parts of our community that believes that they'd like to see their community policed differently, and officers from GRPD interact differently. And so there's funding in the budget to improve cultural competency and how the community experiences its police department, and to co-create training, particularly de-escalation and use of force training with the police department, and it not only to create the training for them, but also to experience it with them. And we think when it's that shared experience, that officers are not, and we have a very highly trained department, but most of the training is by experts who are in law enforcement, among law enforcement professionals. But I think when you enter and add that community voice and training, it will make the experience more enriched, both for the community, and it will give officers greater insight of the lived experience of community members.
Yeah, I tend to believe that, when we talk about the issue of policing, we're talking about an institution, a structure that has layers of complexity. And I take great pride in being a student of police reform, community violence, police community relations, and I am very well aware that what we're experiencing here in Grand Rapids is something that's being experienced and has been experienced in other urban centers throughout the country. And yet there's the desire to want to do all that we can here to create an environment in which there is perhaps a greater sense of mutual respect between police and community. And although that might not be the case in other parts of the country, my focus is here in the 616. What can we do to create an environment where there is the ability to coexist? And I think, again, if you take the opportunity to study the issue of law enforcement and its interaction with, in particular, the African American community, the history is not kind. And so to ignore it, I think, would be foolish. And I think we have a responsibility to lean in and to sit in that place of tension to try to find better, because you have, again, history that is spoken very clearly, and it speaks to all that that's involved in terms of having a system and a structure that has, again, historically not been kind to the African American community. I can say that with great confidence. But that's what's happened historically. Again, I feel like my job as a commissioner is to try to find a path forward while recognizing and giving the respect to what's happened historically, but how can we move forward into a better place between police and community?
Okay. Well, wanted to ask what might be some of the specifics. What would it look like when citizen community members are involved in the training of some of these higher end levels of policing?
Well, it's we're going to co-create it, but it has been done in other communities, where you begin with the co-design of some of the components of training. Obviously, there are specific laws and practices that officers must be trained on, but hearing that from a different cultural perspective may inform not what they do, but how they do it differently. And having the context of the community experience, and knowing whether it is interacting with different immigrant or refugee communities. We've talked about Patrick Leoya was Congolese, and having more Congolese members of the community, we've been meeting with them, involved in some of the public policy issues that we have in the city, and specifically within the police department. And the police chief, Winstrom, who's only been here since early March, has found himself facing a lot of challenges with, obviously, with the with crime rate as well as the current pending investigation, but he's also been open to listening how we might do things differently, and that includes training and recruiting, and having the community help us with that to improve the diversity in the department. So the curriculum, what the officers hear, how they hear it, the impact of some of their practices on community members, I think learned and experience in the classroom will make for better outcomes when they're out on the street and interacting with citizens.
Okay. I think we're going to take another break right now, but come back to this topic in just a bit. This is City Connection on GRTV Livewire Channel 24.
The Wealthy Theater is Grand Rapids' local movie theater and performance center. Since 1998, it has been a host to nationally touring music groups, local theater performances, and a variety of community events. Today, the Wealthy Theater is not only a landmark community treasure with historic significance, but a pioneer in the infusion of technology and traditional theater. Underneath the elegance and classic sensibility that defines Wealthy Theater, there is a matrix of new technologies. The theater is completely digital and outfitted with cameras and microphones for concerts, theater and comedy troupes, speakers and lecturers, and so much more. Experience all that Wealthy Theater has to offer. And bring a friend. Be surprised by the Wealthy Theater.
WYCE is a world of music. We aim to shine a light on underserved musical artists in a non-commercial format with no advertisements. Volunteers come in to create personalized music programming that broadcasts over the air at 88.1 FM to West Michigan and via the internet to listeners all over the world. These listeners sponsor our efforts, keeping WYCE independent and community-owned. Musicians use the station to broaden their audience and build support for their latest projects by submitting their music to be included in our broadcast and performing live in studio. Businesses find their customers through underwriting, nonprofits inform the community to their mission, and listeners stay informed about local events. We believe that music is a powerful force that creates quality relationships in our community, that speaks to our emotions, and provides the soundtrack to our lives.
Welcome back to City Connection. In the GRTV studio with me is City Manager Mark Washington along with Second Ward Commissioner Joe Jones. We were just talking a little bit about some budget priorities, some things in the budget, and specifically when it comes to policing and maybe co-creating with community members some of the policy and trainings. Do have a couple questions from folks that now that we've hit the topic of policing, and one is, does Grand Rapids support policing in the schools, officers in the schools?
You know, historically, there has been a relationship that's been ongoing between GRPD and GRPS. I know that currently the security staff at GRPS schools are unarmed, and I think that it has been under the tutelage of a former police officer by way of Larry Johnson, who heads up all facets of security for the district. I think that there's the expectation that throughout the country there will be more discussions since the horrible incident that occurred, horrific incident that occurred in Uvalde, Texas. And there is, I think that's an ongoing question. I think that we can expect to have more and more schools who are perhaps given the opportunity to tap into funding for armed officers in schools. I would suggest that that would be something that question would go directly to Dr. Roby at GRPS or Larry Johnson at GRPS, simply because I think that there's no doubt, I can't speak for the chief, but I can say that I think the chief would be open to whatever it is that the school district desires to do. I don't think there would be any effort to try to force the issue, but I think that we can expect that same question to come about for every school district in the country ever since, again, the tragedy of Uvalde.
Yeah, I think that's a good public policy question for school officials and superintendent. But I will say on the emergency preparedness response, we put another $150,000 in the budget, I believe, for our emergency manager. A few years ago, we have a full-time person that's responsible for both planning and scenario training for emergencies, whether they're natural disasters or response to critical incidents such as that or cyber attacks. Allison Ferroli is our emergency manager. And one of the things we are certain of in the event that any situation like that happens, we do have preparedness plans, and the departments train frequently to be responsive and to take the appropriate action in those critical incidents. So that I'm very confident of, that our response will be appropriate given the kind of risks that could be facing schools and our officers. I spoke to Chief Winstrom about it. Will not be reluctant to act to eliminate the threat.
Okay. The second question on that topic in a different sort of way, though, is this person says, I've heard that the city of Grand Rapids can't fire cops because of the contract with the police union. Is that the case? And then how much are the city's hands tied when it comes to firing GRPD officers?
Okay. So thank you for that very passive question. It's pretty direct. So in general, so the city as an employer is, we have collective bargaining agreements that cover almost 98% of our workforce. We have 14 or so different bargaining units. And the police, they're part of the bargaining units, but even our non-sworn employees who work in water and parks, they're covered by labor agreements as well. There is some added protections for law enforcement. And I won't talk about just GRPD, but just statewide added protections for law enforcement in terms of the rights, because of the decision making that law enforcement officers have on a day-to-day basis, amount of discretion, and ultimately, as we unfortunately had to see, to use force to include deadly force. There are rights and protections that they have. They can be held accountable. They can be terminated. The police department has terminated officers who have not followed department policy or utilize indiscretion and has demonstrated misconduct. But there are rights where officers are able to grieve or appeal decisions from the department. There is an internal appeal process. There's also a process that goes to if a citizen has a complaint against an officer and believe that they've not followed departmental policy, have done something inappropriate, complaints can be made to the Oversight Office, which is also funded in this budget, Internal Affairs. And if a citizen believes that they have not gotten the kind of outcome from that complaint process, they can appeal it to a Citizens Advisory Board, the CAB, and to make sure that officers are held accountable for complaints that are made by them. So the answer is yes, police officers can be held accountable as any other city employees, but there is a very procedural, prescribed administrative process that ultimately allows officers to appeal before an arbitrator. And a third-party arbitrator will hear the appeal of the disciplined officer, hear the case of the employer, and make an independent decision.
Okay. Yeah, that was definitely a direct question. And then I wanted to ask, have you felt that your hands have been tied, you oversee the police chief, in any of the situations that have come out over the last year or two?
Have I felt that my hands have been tied? Well, I look at it this way. I feel like as city manager, I utilize every tool available to me to manage the workforce. And would I like more tools and more direct management? Of course I would. But as it is right now, I feel very comfortable managing the organization in the way that we have. Of course, we would like to see, when it comes to just like gun reform and police reform, we can't all do it at the local level based on what happens now. There are federal and state guidelines and laws that have to change to give us more local control. And there's such partisan gridlock now, both at the federal and state level, on gun reform and police reform. So there are some things I wish that we would have greater ability to do. I mean, if it were up to most managers, they would like their decisions to be the final decision. But we do have due process in place, and we have to give people due process. And the appeal process through the arbitration is something that once the decision goes there, my hands are tied, and I'm unable to overrule arbitrator decision. But that's the process, and until the laws change, that's the hand that we're dealt. Now there's opportunity. The public can make an appeal to their legislators and see if there's a political will to change it. But until then, that's the complexity. Commissioner Jones mentioned tension before, but there's tension and complexity. And that's the complexity that we have to operate in. And I appreciate the question, because most members of the public don't understand that. They just think that you can hear news reports, see what happens on TV, and it's so obvious what needs to happen, and you should immediately exercise that management discretion. But that is not within the process that we have to abide in, and it has to be objective. And if we prematurely do something of that nature, we will have our decisions overturned by outside arbitrator. Commissioner, your thoughts on that?
No, I just think that there's always the temptation to look at a problem or an issue and apply what seems to be very pragmatic, very simple solutions. And it's I think all the more difficult for us as legislators to share that it's just not that easy, right? That there are processes in place that require movement from other governing bodies that we can't. They're decisions we can't make. So as city managers mentioned, there are federal mandates, there are state mandates, and I think quite often the assumption is, well, you all can do everything at the city. Well, I wish it were that easy. Just like as the city manager said, he wishes that his word was the final word, but that's not the case. And so it makes it, I think, all the more frustrating, even for myself as a legislator, to again, how then can we move forward and try to find solutions to very complex issues, and do so without getting caught up in the gridlock that exists currently in our country at both the state and the federal level politically. It's frustrating, to say the least. Yeah.
We're going to take a break in just about a minute, but I did want to follow up on, there's been some uptick of gun violence, and it's typical in the summer. We do see that, but we're so very, very aware right now. So what has happened this past weekend in the city, and what kind of efforts are following that?
Yep. Well, but part of, and recently we had a homicide that occurred in the downtown area, and occurred at 12:15 or so in the morning, and we expect some of additional, safety issues when you have a very active nightlife, right? Very vibrant city. That's in many communities. What I appreciate about Grand Rapids, this is not something that happens on a weekly basis like in other cities. And so when an incident such as that has happened, where we have multiple people shot and a life loss, it's obviously very gripping. And we continue to evaluate those incidents and see what has happened, what can be done to prevent it. And I think our city, for the most part, is still safe. I mean, this is the 10th homicide of the year, and we're about at the halfway point almost, if you will. I wish there were none at this time. And the police department's still investigating, but what we know from what's happened this weekend is that the suspect has been arrested, apprehended. There are good witnesses. Accountability will occur, but no matter what happens, that person's life will not, won't get that back. And so I don't know all the particulars around it at this point, but obviously I mentioned earlier the need for more responsible gun ownership, gun reform. What we can do locally, we have in the budget. We've worked with all of our partners and community partners, our SAFE Committee, SAFE Task Force. Commissioner Lanier's really talked about having more gun buybacks. We've done that a couple of times to try to get the number of guns off the street. We'll continue to do that. But for the most part, this still is a very safe community. In light of what has happened comparatively to other communities, we're still a very safe community, and we're going to work on what things can we do with crime prevention. There has been discussion around surveillance, and that's one of those. I like the word you said, tension, because we know more cities that have more surveillance are able to both prevent and solve crimes more rapidly, because there's a truth teller to what has happened or what's about to happen. But there's this element of trust, and we have been working with community partners around enhancing surveillance technology. NAACP has been a great partner in looking at the policy, and I'm looking forward to exploring ways in which we can make our community safer.
Okay, we're going to take our final break, and then we'll be back with a follow-up question to that, and it has to do a little bit with trusting the process. So a break now for City Connection here on GRTV Livewire Channel 24.
How do you build a strong local food economy? Meet Chris. Chris is opening Osteria Rosa, a locally sourced Italian restaurant in a building brought back to life by 616 Development. But he doesn't know any local farmers to supply him with food year-round. This is Melissa. Melissa runs the Fulton Street Farmers Market and publishes a long list, even in the dead of winter, of available produce, meats, bakery goods, and more on the Rapidian. This is Amy. Amy wants to do more to support the farmers and her local food economy. Amy talks to Melissa, who introduces her to farmers at the Fulton Street Farmers Market, and Amy, in turn, publishes their stories, also on the Rapidian. Chris hears about the Rapidian and now has access to a local grocery list and information that he needs to make connections with local farmers. He feeds his patrons with local food year-round. Connections multiply. Meals are shared. A stronger local food economy is built.
Welcome back to City Connection. In studio with me is Commissioner Joe Jones and City Manager Mark Washington. And Commissioner Jones, you wanted to follow up a little bit on what we were just discussing before the break.
Yeah, the issue of community violence. As City Manager Washington mentioned, I was an early adapter and just a huge supporter of Cure Violence, recognizing that it is not it's not going to be the ultimate problem solver with regards to community violence. But I believe it helps, and it has helped and will help. But if it's one issue that is absolutely crushing, at least to me, as well as I think to any community, it is when you see our young sons and daughters who are involved in community violence, and it really speaks to everything from perhaps a significant feeling of hopelessness. The number of illegal guns that are available on the streets, and at the end of the day, the need to perhaps lean in all the more around, the root cause of just really asking the question: how do we get here? How do we get to a point where you have community violence that's the norm throughout the country, and how do we get to a place where we are just we recognize it as perhaps requiring a state of emergency, because probably the most unfortunate aspect of it is the communities in which it most adversely affects, right? So you're talking about, again, historically marginalized populations, African Americans, Latinx, and really the need to all the more invest in those those communities, but also really answering the question again, going back to how do we get here, and again, as I've mentioned before, sitting in that tension, because as has been said, the old saying of the truth hurts, and I don't know if we're as a community, as an entire community, if we're ever really open to engaging to having a conversation around some truths behind, community violence and the need to be all the more intentional, again, at getting at root cause and beginning to turn the tide, because it really begs the question of, what does a community look like that does not have violence, right? And I want to suggest it's everything from, perhaps more stable families to access to economic prosperity, access to better educational outcomes, health outcomes. You have little to no violence, but also, guess what? You have probably then a limited need for police presence, right? So I think there is a path forward, but with all of the really big issues before us, it requires a significant commitment of time and resources that's beyond the scope of what the city can do. This is very much a perfect example of needing all hands on deck if we're really going to solve something like community violence.
Yeah, I think you're right. In addition to, it's more than just a moral issue. I mean, and some people try to simplify it as such, and you're right. There are laws, and there should be consequences for following and not following the laws. But what you're saying is, why do people choose not to do it? And there are these underlying social, economic, or environmental factors that make certain people exposed to that kind of lifestyle or response. And if that's what you grow up seeing and you see other people do it, and eventually if that's how you're taught to handle conflict, to handle aggression, or if you don't have the appropriate access to health care, as you said earlier, to cope with difficulties in life in mental health. And I'm not trying to condone or excuse it, but I think what we're trying to do is to say we need to better understand it. And what we found out, we can't just arrest our way out of this, and we can't police our way solely out of it. There has to be a more holistic approach. And the city itself, and we're doing as much as we can holistically. We're having the mental health co-response, behavioral health response for certain calls for police services that don't require police officers, but it's a bigger system than that. It has to be integrated with education. It has to be integrated, as you said, with economic opportunities, and removing employment barriers and access to capital for small businesses. And it is a huge lift. But and it's been something that we have been systemically dealing with as a country for, since the inequities have started since 1619. But while some people are asking for immediate resolution to these, while there's not an immediate resolution, we are making progress. And every year I have to ask, and we measure, statistically, what are some of the things that we're doing to show equitable investments. This budget, I didn't mention earlier, there's over $36 million in investments that advance equity throughout our community. And so the level of intentionality of making sure that we have good equitable outcomes in everything that we do is a value of the City Commission, and it's one of the reasons why I chose to move to Grand Rapids and work for this governing body.
You're talking, both of you, a little bit about the tensions that are out there, and then just how there's many sides to everything. And this citizen has a comment on that, and just wants to know a little bit about we hear about trusting the process, and there's a lot of skepticism. So how do we kind of build that trust when there are folks out there that feel that they've been let down time and again?
Well, I'll start without going into the details of the pending investigation of the officer involved shooting the killing of Patrick Lyoya. There is a very prescribed process, part because there wasn't trust that the city of Grand Rapids, city by policy made some years ago, saying if there's ever an officer involved shooting, because of the skepticism of police investigating police, in those instances we defer to the Michigan State Police to do an independent investigation so that there could be a better perceived view of trust and autonomy. And that investigation's turned over to another person outside of the organization, Grand Rapids, the prosecutor, so that they can make a determination around any criminality, if there's any criminality involved. And then after we get both of those facts, both the investigation from state police as well as the prosecutor, the police chief will make an administrative decision on whether or not there's any policy violations in light of those facts that are gathered. And that process has, with this case, has taken time. And then I guess the fourth element is if anyone disagrees with, a complainant disagrees with the actions that the police chief has taken regarding the internal affairs investigative process and administrative review, they can appeal that to the Citizens Appeals Board. Yeah, and I get that. That's a long process, and people have tried it before, and the outcomes that they were hoping for earlier on didn't either occur fast enough or didn't occur exactly like they've had. My response in this particular instance, as far as I'm aware, in recent times, there have not been many officer-involved killings here in this city. And certainly there may be some that predates me, but in recent times, I looked at the statistics, there were over 1,000 that happened in our country last year. And anytime one happens too many. Last time I think one occurred here was 2017 or so. So I would ask, given that, and I know it's easier said than done, I am still hopeful in this process that this one that we've had that the right outcome will occur if we continue to trust the process. Now, I know that there are calls to expedite it, and they want the prosecutor to accelerate his review. We too want that to occur because that just continues to create more attention. But that is something that, unfortunately, we are not in control of. And what I've learned in terms to manage the city is to be absolutely clear on what I can control and to accelerate that. And those things that we can't, we make awareness, but I try not to interfere with it because that's part of the reason we have this third-party process, to make sure that there's no internal interference.
I would just add that with all of these issues, whether it's trusting the process, whether we talk about community violence, there is, as I've talked throughout this hour about the need to join us in the tension and to engage in the uncomfortable. Part of what undergirds all of that, unfortunately, is the very ugly history of race and racism in our country, right? And its impact, not just obviously at a national level, but at a very local level. And the need to engage in conversations is not always easy because it is fraught with emotion, and that's rightfully so. But it's kind of impossible to talk about any form of solution, as I've continued to say, without talking about how we got here. Yeah. And there's this, depending on who you are and perhaps your lived experience, it's not something that some folks want to talk about. But we shouldn't expect to have real tangible or just a progress that we can be proud of until we recognize the need to further engage in dialogue about that very issue that has been just the albatross around that has enfolded us as a country.
Second Ward Commissioner Joe Jones and City Manager Mark Washington, thanks for the in-depth conversations, the thoughtful conversations today here on City Connection. And that'll be it for us today. We will also have a hiatus during the month of July. This is City Connection on GRTV, Livewire, Channel 24.